"The serpent deceived me, and I ate." And the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." And then we have a hint of the gospel. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. She shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." To the woman he said, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desires shall be contrary to your husband, and he shall rule over you." And to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. So cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." The man called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Thus from Adam sin entered the world, for in Adam all have sinned. So sin passed upon all people. Unless you think that you would have done differently, we are not better than Adam. So sin has passed upon all people. Romans chapter 5 tells us, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law of Moses, before the law was given. But sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death still reigned from Adam to Moses, even those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. See, Adam knew it was wrong to eat of the tree, and he chose to eat anyway. 1 Timothy chapter 2 tells us Adam was not deceived. He had clearly been told what to do by God, yet he did not believe. He did not take God at His word. Instead, Adam transgressed. He knowingly disobeyed the single command God had given. So while sin was not counted to those between Adam and Moses, because it was not explicitly known to be sin, it was still sin nonetheless. Murder was still sin, even if the individual was not explicitly told, murder is sin. Even while sin was not explicitly known, death reigned upon all people. How can that be? Those who did not explicitly know the commands of God were still breaking the law of God, and thus under the judgment of God. How can that be? Romans chapter 2. "For all who have sinned without the law of Moses will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers," and that is a perfect obedience to the law. The doers of the law, those are the only ones who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their conscience also bears witness. Their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. And on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, even those who do not know the explicit law of God are still subject to the law of God, for their hearts bear witness against them of right and wrong. There is enough written into every human being to condemn them. We know that murder is wrong. We know that theft is wrong. We know lying is wrong. We do not need a written law to tell us this. We know it. Yet one might say, well, conscience is not always clear enough. If I but knew exactly what God required, well, then I could keep it, and thus I could be righteous before God. God gave the written law. And yes, it is a law that if, such a small word, if a person perfectly keeps it, well then yes, they would be right before God. Romans 7:7, the Apostle Paul tells us this, "Yet if it had not been for the law, I should not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.'" The law made it clear. Therefore, the law made sin clear. And in that clarity, a promise of life. Yet the very thought that a person could keep the law perfectly, well, that thought is crushed under the reality of God's law. Romans 7, verse 10, the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. It is impossible to perfectly keep the law of God. All the law does is tell me every fault. The law of God tells me every wrong. The law of God tells me every sin I have ever done. The law is merciless. The law is merciless. Thus, the law becomes a weight we cannot bear. But that's because the law was never intended to save you. In perfect fairness, perfect justice, and with a complete lack of mercy, the law simply demonstrates where every human falls short. And thus the law demonstrates the truth that all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Sin is the breaking of God's law in thought or action. Murder is the outward expression, the action of a heart that has hatred in it. Adultery is the outward expression, the action of lusting in the heart. Theft is the outward expression, the action of coveting in your heart. A haughty look is the outward expression. It is the action of pride in your heart. And we know that Jesus taught that it is not simply enough not to murder. But if one has hatred in their heart, that is also breaking God's law. It is not enough simply to not commit the act of adultery. One must not even lust in one's own heart. Each of these and more are a breaking of God's law, and every breaking of God's law incurs a greater and greater debt of sin. Every law that is broken incurs a debt, a citation, a wage. The wages of a lawbreaker is death. And this is what the law makes clear. There is a debt of sin for those who break God's law. There's a cup of wrath for all those who have broken God's law. There is a curse upon all who have broken God's law. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. The legal debt that mankind has earned is death. Eternal separation from God in hell. Mankind has sinned against an eternal God, and thus the debt of sin is eternal separation. Justice demands, it requires that the debt be paid. If the debt is not paid, then justice is not done, and if God does not carry out justice, then He is not just. Yet we would be wrong to think of God as being bound by justice, as if he himself was willing to overlook sin, but He couldn't because justice has to happen. Well, no, that would actually make justice a villain and God a slave to it. No, for sin is not simply a cold, calculated equation that God must follow through on. No, sin is an affront to God's very character because He is just. Because He is just. Sin is something that brings out an emotional response in the God of heaven and earth. The appropriate emotional response of a perfect, just, holy God upon sin is wrath. God's wrath against sin and against the sinners who commit sin, we find described in Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 15. God's wrath against sin and sinners is this. It is a day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Think of it. How would you respond to the ones who you had created, the ones who you loved and cherished, yet at the first chance to break your one rule, they shake their fist in your face? God's wrath is perfect in justice. The legal penalty of sin is death, and it is a penalty that is accompanied by God's just wrath. Think of one who has murdered an innocent. Think of that one being arrested, tried, and receiving the just penalty of death as a result of that one's actions. Justice is not without emotion. The death is the penalty, and wrath is the emotion that goes with it. For all who sin are under this curse of sin. Yet God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. God's justice and wrath are also accompanied by love. Think back to the one who committed murder. Now think of the parent of the one who committed that murder. That parent, they know their child deserves that penalty, and they may even feel wrathful at the thought of it, of, yes, you deserve this, yet they still love their child, not because there is any good in them, but because they love. In a similar way, not exactly, but in a similar way, God's justice and wrath are accompanied by love for His rebellious, sinful creation. And so godly love must act. Justice and wrath must be satisfied. The debt that is owed must be paid. Yet love had a plan that was made before creation began. Before God first uttered those words, "Let there be light." The plan was Jesus. God in flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. The Christ would come. Jesus would live the life you and I could not live, perfectly keeping the law. He would take the place of sinners. He would die that sinful humanity might have a way to be reconciled to God. And because Jesus is both fully God and fully man, His payment would be an eternal payment. Yet the fact remained, someone must carry the curse of sin. Someone must drink the cup of God's wrath. Death must be tasted. justice must be satisfied. And it is here that we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The cup of wrath, the curse of God. Matthew 26. Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup, the cup of God's wrath, pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And Jesus came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again, Jesus came and found them, the disciples, sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And it is here that Jesus begins to drink the cup of God's wrath. It is here that he begins to drink the full, complete, undiluted judgment that is owed. Jesus is taken to Annas, and in the middle of the night, Jesus is illegally tried. Annas begins to question Jesus concerning his teachings. And to this line of questioning, Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." And the response to that is a blow from one of the officers. From Annas, Jesus is taken to another location, all of this in the middle of the night. Here he sits before Caiaphas, the high priest, and the other Sanhedrin, Jewish leaders. Matthew 26. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And this meeting by the Sanhedrin was again illegal. According to Jewish law, quote, "in capital cases that may end in execution, they hold the trial during the daytime, and the verdict must also be reached during the daytime. In capital cases, a verdict of acquittal may be reached on the same day, but a verdict of conviction cannot be reached until the following day." Due to the rush nature of this mock trial, the false witnesses had no opportunity to corroborate their accusations. Many false witnesses bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And so the failure of the witnesses drove high priest Caiaphas to put Jesus under an oath. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." The high priest knew what Jesus had claimed at his triumphal entry. And Caiaphas knew what Jesus had taught about himself. Yet Jesus responds with what would be his own condemnation. But he responds with the truth. "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And so the high priest tears his clothes and he calls for a judgment. "What is your judgment?" Matthew 26:66. And they answered, "He deserves death." Yet all the while this trial is going on, in the courtyard, in the sight of this, is Peter. And during this back and forth with Caiaphas, Peter denies the Lord 3 times. Jesus had foretold that Peter would deny him, and as the cock crowed the second time, Jesus looks at Peter. Peter remembers, and Peter weeps. And in order to give the appearance of legality, the Jewish leaders reassemble at daybreak in the temple. They desire to ratify their illegal proceedings, their perversion of justice. But the Jews were unable to execute someone legally. That authority was held by the Romans. So they have to convince the Romans to carry out this execution. So they send Jesus to Pilate. Pilate then sends Jesus over to Herod, and then Herod sends him back again to Pilate. And we read in Luke 23, Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him." And so Pilate, as a good Roman ruler, offers to beat Jesus and then release him. Yet that offer doesn't work to placate the Jews. So he tries to do something else according to their custom. Pilate makes this offer. He says in John 18, "But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews, Jesus?" The flogging should have placated this bloodthirsty mob, yet it only seemed to drive them to greater desire for blood. So much so that they refused to let Jesus go and would rather take Barabbas, a convicted murderer, than Jesus. John 19. When the chief priests and the officers saw Jesus, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Finally, Pilate, in fear of the people, he washes his hands and acquiesces to their demand. And the Jews in bloodlust cry out, "We have no king but Caesar." And they accept the responsibility of executing Jesus. Matthew 27:25, Jesus' blood be on us and on our children. So at the end of these trials, the guilty Barabbas is freed, and Jesus the innocent is sent to die. The cup is drank, the debt is paid. Tetelestai. Jesus is taken and he is beaten. His back is shredded as soldiers mock him. The crown of thorns cause blood to pour into his eyes and into what is left of his beard. The soldiers spit in his face, place the robe upon his back. Soldiers grow tired of mocking. They place the cross upon his back, and he begins his journey to the place of the skull, Golgotha. Most likely due to a loss of blood before he can reach that final summit. He collapses under the weight of the cross. Soldiers forcibly recruit Simon the Cyrene to help Jesus. At Golgotha, the blood-soaked robe is ripped from Jesus' back, reopening the wounds. Jesus is stretched out, his hands are nailed to the cross, and there at the place of the skull, Jesus is lifted up and hung between two thieves. Deuteronomy 21. He that is hanged is accursed of God. There on that cross, Jesus is mocked and he suffered. On that cross, he drank the full, undiluted cup of the wrath of God that humanity had earned. Jesus bore the full weight of the curse of sin. My God, why have you forsaken me? On that cross, as the Apostle Paul would later write, for our sake, God made Jesus to be sin. Jesus, the one who knew no sin. Jesus bore the curse of God. During this time, the sky darkens. The words of Zephaniah were at least in part fulfilled. A day of wrath is that day. A day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. For this cup of wrath is the just penalty of sin, and Jesus bore it in my place. "6 hours. The cup is drank, and the final bit of the debt must be paid in full. The wages of sin is death." Jesus cries to Telestai, a common word, a word that was most often used to signify the end of a transaction. A word that meant full payment has been received, the debt is paid, it is finished. A common trade word that means paid in full, and Jesus cries out to Telestai, "It is finished." John 19, verse 30. And Jesus said, "It is finished." He bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. John 19. Since it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth. He has borne witness that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Quote, not one of his bones will be broken. Romans chapter 5 tells us, while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. At the right time, Christ died for me. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, rebels, guilty, Christ died for us. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, he asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So Joseph came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who had earlier come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen cloths with spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. It is Good Friday. Christ has hung on the cross. Christ has been forsaken by his Father. Christ has been left alone. The earth has trembled, the sky grows dark, and the King of all creation yielded his spirit. Hope was lost. Death had won. Sin had conquered. It's Friday. Jesus is buried. A soldier stands guard, and a rock is rolled into place. But it's Friday. It is only Friday. And hallelujah, Sundays are coming. You are dismissed.